Hello everyone, and I wish to welcome you now as we continue on this journey of understanding who Jesus is and especially what He has done for us in His redemption. As we discussed earlier, the effects of original sin from Adam and Eve has been ingrained not only in ourselves but also throughout the course of human history and even in the universe itself. The question is how is Jesus going to begin to reverse and in fact conquer this process and to begin to make all things new and raise us up to that place where God had intended us from the beginning? So what we discover is that Jesus is, as the new Adam, is extremely different than how the first Adam acted, very different from the Adam experience and even the Lucifer experience. Remember, in both of those experiences, they chose with their free will to puff themselves up in disobedience, in pride, and in a certain sense of hostility towards God by not obeying God and doing what God had asked them to do. Rather, Jesus, instead of seeking fame and money and wealth and power in this world, which He could have done, we discover that Jesus instead divests Himself of all of those things. Now, the difference also between Adam and the new Adam, Jesus, is that Adam never was God. His temptation, like Lucifer's, was to become like God, so that he could have this knowledge of good and evil and sort of puff himself up to be a God. That's the problem with human pride, and that's the problem that we still have to this day. But he never was God. He was trying to grasp at something which never belonged to Him. That's called theft. Jesus, we discover, is in fact one with the Father. He is God the Son of God the Father. St. Paul tells us that even though He was in the very form of God, He did not consider equality with God something to be grasped at, but rather He emptied Himself. He divested Himself of that power and that glory. So that He, while owning it, divested Himself. Very different from Adam, who never owned it and tried to take a theft grab at it, to grasp at it. So Jesus shows us that model which God begins to reverse our brokenness, our pride, our arrogance, our sinfulness through the redeeming life of Jesus Christ. How He lives His life out of service to God first and to the people that God His Father placed in His life, caring for them, their needs, even challenging them to get away from their fallenness and their brokenness and to live a life of holiness and goodness. Jesus will ultimately take the problems that we have caused ourselves from our sinfulness and bad behaviors, particularly the qualities of that eternal separation from God and also in this world, suffering and death. While we deserve it because of our arrogance and pride, He did not. Of all people, He did not. Even in His life of service and miracle working, He could have just avoided that whole experience of suffering and death. But He doesn't. Jesus shows us the redeeming quality that God has for us by taking our bull by the horns and looking it straight in the eyes and saying to death, to sin and suffering, I am going to conquer you. You will not conquer me. And so He takes His life and He pours Himself out on the cross. Jesus pours out His life. Rather than trying to save His life or to amass pleasure or power or wealth, He divests Himself of all of that. And He pours out His very body, His soul, His blood, everything, so that you and I, who are broken in sin and could never reach that point of perfection, can experience forgiveness in our lives. That you and I can experience redemption and that process that Jesus gives us through the waters of baptism in His suffering and in His blood to be washed clean. To be washed clean of our iniquities. And not only does He pour Himself out as the Lamb of sacrifice for us, but He also is going to be raised up from the dead. Death will not have the final answer. Death will not have the final sting, which is what you and I often experience in our lives. Rather, death will become conquered by Jesus Christ and will become now the birthing place for resurrection. Jesus' body is risen 3 days later after his suffering and death by God his Father. It is the sign that he has in fact conquered sin, that he has conquered death, that he has conquered everything that has caused the brokenness in all of our human experiences. He has conquered that which you and I could never conquer on our own because of our weaknesses and our failures. In his resurrection, Jesus gives us true hope. The very presence of God that lightens our darkness and shows us that hope, that tunnel, that path that God has given us to everlasting life. It is in the raising of Jesus from the dead that our humanity that was prone to decay and death is now restored to that original place that God intended for Adam and Eve, but even a much higher and better state. Because in the risen body of Christ, you and I will experience the power of resurrection when our time comes, when we experience suffering and death. Inevitably, we will, unless the second coming occurs during our lifetime, which is possible. But if it doesn't, you and I will experience suffering and death. But instead of running away from it, rather than seeing it as a point of anger or frustration, we can see it now as a point of redemption and that channel which births us to the hope of resurrection.